My husband bragged about his promotion, so I used his iPhone to trigger his boss's bedroom automation in front of the entire executive board. I was sitting at a candlelit, custom-built mahogany dining table, surrounded by my husband's elite executive board, when I pressed a single digital button on his iPhone and watched the CEO realize his new vice president was sleeping with the boss. The heavy, iron-wrought front door of the sprawling estate slammed locked with a deafening metallic echo, the lights dropped into a sultry, romantic dim, and the oxygen instantly evaporated from the massive dining room. The entire evening had been built on a foundation of meticulously crafted, sweating paranoia. For the entire 45-minute drive out to the ultra-wealthy, gated suburbs, Mark had gripped the leather steering wheel of his Audi so tightly his knuckles were completely drained of color. The rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, blurring the streetlights into streaks of neon yellow, but the weather wasn't what was making him act like a terrified, hyper-ventilating intern. It was the destination. He had just landed a massive, life-changing promotion to regional VP of sales, and his notoriously reclusive, brilliant new boss, Jessica, was hosting an intimate black-tie dinner party to celebrate the new executive alignment. "I really hope I don't get lost out here," Mark muttered, his eyes frantically darting between the slick, dark road and the glowing GPS map on the dashboard screen. He tapped the display nervously with his index finger. "I've never even been to this side of the city. I heard Jessica is a total ghost about her private life. Nobody from the office has ever been to her actual house. Just make sure you don't bring up work tonight, Jane. She's incredibly protective of her sanctuary." "I'm a network architect, Mark," I replied smoothly, adjusting the silver clasp on my clutch. "I couldn't care less about your quarterly enterprise software sales targets. I'm just here to drink expensive Cabernet and eat whatever catered food she's providing. Relax. You earned this promotion. Stop acting like you're about to be interrogated by the FBI." He offered a tight, synthetic smile that didn't reach his eyes, his jaw muscles clenching and unclenching. At the time, I thought it was just standard corporate imposter syndrome. I build complex, military-grade secure network protocols and mobile architectures for international financial institutions. My world is binary, logical, and entirely transparent to me. Mark's world was relationship-based, built on golf course handshakes, aggressive charisma, and fragile corporate egos. I assumed the pressure of dining with the CEO and his new boss was just short-circuiting his nerves. We pulled through a set of towering, wrought iron security gates that silently rolled open as the camera recognized his license plate. I noted the high-end, infrared optical sensors mounted on the stone pillars. Jessica didn't just have money, she had a paranoid, heavily invested interest in keeping the outside world firmly outside. The driveway wound through an acre of impeccably manicured, aggressively dark landscaping before terminating in front of a sprawling, breathtaking modern glass and stone architectural masterpiece. A valet in a sharp gray vest took the Audi, and Mark and I walked up the floating concrete steps to the massive front entryway. Before Mark could even raise his hand to the brushed steel doorbell, the door swung open. Jessica was standing there in a stunning, emerald green silk backless gown, holding a crystal coupe of champagne. She was 10 years older than me, radiated an aura of ruthless, predatory confidence, and wore a smile that felt entirely rehearsed. "Mark," she purred, stepping forward to press a lingering, overly familiar kiss to his cheek. "You made it through the storm. And you must be the famous Jane. Mark talks about your tech projects all the time. Come in, come in. Richard and the others are already in the parlor." I stepped over the threshold, and my professional instincts instantly, involuntarily kicked in. The house was an absolute fortress of integrated smart home technology. As a senior mobile architect, I don't just look at a house, I read its invisible infrastructure. I spotted the flush-mounted Ubiquiti Wi-Fi 6 access points seamlessly blended into the drywall ceilings. I noticed the tiny, fiber-optic ambient light sensors embedded in the baseboards. I saw the Somfy motorized tracks on the massive floor-to-ceiling silk drapes. Whoever had wired this estate knew exactly what they were doing. It was a closed-loop, hyper-secure local mesh network. For the first 2 hours, the party was painfully standard corporate theater. There were 8 of us in total. Richard, the gray-haired, booming CEO, his elegant wife, another senior director, Mark, me, and Jessica holding court like a feudal queen in her castle. We drank vintage champagne, ate microscopic truffle-infused hors d'oeuvres, and politely laughed at Richard's terrible golf anecdotes. Mark stayed glued to my side, his hand resting heavily on the small of my back, playing the role of the devoted, newly minted executive husband with sickening perfection. By 8:30 p.m., we were ushered into the formal dining room. The table was a massive slab of live-edge walnut, set with heavy silver and dark crystal. As I sat down, I reached into my silk clutch to grab my phone. I needed to text our babysitter, Chloe. Our 4-year-old son, Leo, had been fighting a low-grade fever all afternoon, and I wanted to make sure his temperature hadn't spiked before we sat down down for a 2-hour multi-course meal. I pressed the power button. The screen flashed a dead battery icon and instantly went black. I had been compiling heavy code on my laptop in the car and totally forgot to charge my personal device. I leaned over to Mark, who was deep in a sycophantic conversation with Richard about Q3 projections. I smoothly slid my hand into the inner breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out his iPhone 14 Pro. He didn't even flinch. We had completely open device policies in our marriage. We knew each other's passcodes. We had nothing to hide, or so the carefully constructed illusion dictated. I quietly excused myself from the table, holding his phone, and walked out into the massive, gleaming marble kitchen to find a charging cable. I leaned against the cold quartzite island, swiped up on his screen, and punched in his 6-digit passcode, Leo's birthday. The phone unlocked smoothly. I opened iMessage, typed in a quick text to Chloe asking for a temperature update, and hit send. The message failed to deliver. A red exclamation point popped up. I frowned, looking at the top right corner of his OLED screen. The cellular signal inside this concrete and steel fortress was completely dead. 0 bars. However, right next to it, the Wi-Fi icon was glowing solid, radiating 3 full, strong arcs of connectivity. My brow furrowed. If he was connected to Wi-Fi, the iMessage should have routed seamlessly through the internet protocol. I swiped down from the top right corner to open his control center, just to toggle the Wi-Fi off and on again to force a handshake with the router. I pressed and held the Wi-Fi module to expand the network details. My eyes scanned the tiny white text, and my developer brain suddenly hit a massive, screeching brick wall. The cognitive dissonance was so sharp it felt like a physical electric shock shooting down my spine. Mark's phone wasn't connected to a generic Jessica_guest_ network. It was connected to a network simply titled J_private_LAN. But that wasn't the detail that made my breathing suddenly stop. Underneath the network name, iOS displayed a specific, unmistakable security tag, hidden network. I build these systems. I know exactly how an 802.11 wireless standard operates. When a router broadcasts a network, it sends out a beacon frame containing the SSID, the name of the Wi-Fi. But if you configure the router to hide the SSID, it stops broadcasting that beacon. The network becomes entirely invisible to any device passively scanning the area. You cannot simply pull up a list of available networks, tap it, and type in a password. To connect to a hidden SSID, you must physically go into your phone settings, tap Other, manually type out the exact, case-sensitive name of the hidden network, select the precise security protocol from a drop-down menu, and then enter the complex password. It is a deliberate, highly intentional, multi-step technological process. It cannot happen by accident. It cannot happen by a device just remembering a router from an office building. I felt the heat rising in my neck, and my vision went totally blurry with rage. The cold marble of the kitchen island pressed sharply against my hip as a terrifying, sickening realization began to flood my system. Mark had explicitly stated in the car that he had never been to this house. He claimed he didn't even know the neighborhood. Yet his phone had not only identified a completely invisible, non-broadcasting network, but it already possessed the encrypted security keys to authenticate and join it silently the second he walked through the front door. My fingers began to tremble slightly as I closed the control center and opened his main settings app. I tapped into the Wi-Fi details for J_private_LAN. I looked at the IP address lease timer. The DHCP server logs showed his device had renewed its IP lease hundreds of times. This wasn't his first time connecting. His device MAC address was permanently whitelisted in her router's secure registry. That's when the real bombshell dropped. I backed out of the Wi-Fi menu and accidentally swiped one screen too far to the right, landing on his Apple HomeKit dashboard widget. Usually, Mark's home app only showed our downtown apartment, our front door lock, our thermostat, and Leo's bedroom camera. But tonight, the UI was completely different. The top of the screen didn't say Jane and Mark's apartment. It said, The Sanctuary Estate. My lungs seized. I physically could not draw oxygen into my chest. I tapped the home app icon, forcing the full application to open. The screen populated with dozens of smart devices, perfectly categorized by room, kitchen island pendants, parlor audio, driveway gates. I tapped the home settings icon in the top corner and looked at the user hierarchy. Jessica was listed as the owner. Right below her, Mark's Apple ID was sitting there, gleaming in high-definition pixels. But he wasn't listed as a guest with temporary access. He was was explicitly categorized with resident privileges. He had full, unmitigated administrative control over her entire multi-million-dollar digital ecosystem. I scrolled down the list of rooms, my thumb shaking so violently I almost dropped the $1,000 device onto the floor. Nursery. I tapped the camera icon. A live, 4K video feed buffered for a millisecond before displaying a dark, quiet room with a sleeping toddler in a high-end crib. Jessica's child. The child she famously never talked about at the office. I backed out and scrolled lower. Master Suite. Under the Master Suite tab, there were controls for the motorized blackout blinds, the ambient perimeter lighting, and the climate control. And sitting right at the very top of the screen was a large, rectangular custom automation scene button. The icon was a crescent moon. The title underneath it read, Midnight Mode. Being a system architect, I didn't just see a button, I saw the underlying logical parameters. You can program HomeKit to execute complex, multivariable if/then statements based on device proximity and time of day. I tapped the small edit dot next to the scene to view the automation scripting. The logic tree loaded instantly, and it was so brutally intimate, so damningly specific, that I actually felt a wave of profound nausea crash into my stomach. The code was completely transparent. If Mark's iPhone connects to J_private_LAN, and time is 2300 hours, then execute scene, Midnight Mode. Action 1, lock front door smart bolt. Action 2, dim master suite and dining lights to 10%. Action 3, ignite master fireplace. He wasn't just having a casual affair. He was integrated into the physical and digital architecture of her life. He was a permanent, expected, recurring variable in her nighttime routine. He was practically living here when he was supposedly working until 2 a.m. on critical enterprise strategy rollouts. This entire dinner party, his nervous act in the car, the fake introductions at the door, it was an elaborate, sociopathic theatrical performance designed specifically to humiliate me while securing his new corporate title. I didn't scream. I didn't break down crying on the immaculate kitchen tiles. The agonizing, suffocating pain of my 10-year relationship shattering into dust instantly crystallized into a state of absolute, icy, mechanical clarity. I am an engineer. When I find a critical vulnerability in a system, I don't panic. I exploit it. I locked his phone, wiped my expression completely blank, and walked slowly back into the dining room. The servers had just brought out the main course, plates of steaming, medium-rare filet mignon topped with seared foie gras. The scent of roasted garlic and rosemary filled the heavy air. I took my seat next to Mark. He immediately reached under the table and placed his hand securely on my thigh, leaning over to whisper, "Everything okay with Leo?" "Everything is perfectly fine," I whispered back, my voice completely dead, hollow, and devoid of any human emotion. I gently removed his hand from my leg and picked up my heavy crystal wine glass. At the head of the table, Jessica was aggressively holding court, twirling the stem of her Cabernet glass, basking in the rapt attention of Richard and the other directors. The conversation had shifted to corporate espionage and data security, a topic she clearly felt she dominated. "I'm a bit paranoid, I'll admit it," Jessica laughed, a sharp, melodic sound that echoed off the mahogany panels. She took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes locking onto Richard's. "When you reach a certain level of equity in this industry, you can't afford to be careless. My estate is a digital Fort Knox. I don't even use standard WPA2 protocols. Even my guest Wi-Fi network has a 32-character hexadecimal password. It's an alphanumeric mix of my golden retriever's microchip number, a specific longitudinal coordinate in the Swiss Alps, and my very first childhood phone number." She smiled a predatory, self-satisfied smile, her gaze sweeping around the table, momentarily meeting Mark's eyes with a secret, invisible electric charge. "Absolutely no one gets into my network without me typing it into their device personally. Security is everything, Richard. If you leave a backdoor open, someone will inevitably walk right through it and take everything you value." I set my wine glass down. The crystal base hit the walnut table with a sharp, echoing clack that cut perfectly through the low hum of conversation. I reached into my lap, brought Mark's iPhone above the table, and placed it perfectly flat in the dead center of the table, right between the glowing silver candelabras. "That is so utterly fascinating, Jessica," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the precise, chilling authority of a boardroom executioner. The table instantly went into a dead, suffocating hush. Because according to the DHCP device logs I'm currently looking at, Mark didn't just type it in. He didn't even use your guest network. Jessica's arrogant smile froze instantly. Her posture went completely rigid. Richard stopped chewing his steak, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth, his thick gray eyebrows drawing together in sudden, sharp confusion. "Jane, what are you talking about?" Mark hissed, his voice trembling slightly. He reached across the table to grab his phone, but I moved my hand fast, pinning the device to the wood. I stared directly into his panicked, wildly dilated eyes. He He's connected to your hidden SSID, Jessica, I continued, projecting my voice so every single syllable bounced off the expensive walls. A network that doesn't even broadcast its existence to the public. To connect to it, he had to manually type the exact network nomenclature. But it gets so much better. I'm a network architect, Richard. I understand device prioritization. Mark's phone isn't just a guest on this network. It's set as a family member on the mesh router. In fact, he has been to this estate so frequently, and for so many hundreds of hours, that his device's MAC address has priority bandwidth routing over Jessica's own corporate laptop. Mark turned a ghostly, horrifying shade of gray. All the blood violently drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like wet ash. The veneer of the confident, rising corporate star violently peeled away, revealing a terrified, pathetic little boy caught in a massive, undeniable lie. Jane, I must have connected at the office, he stammered, his voice cracking, sweat instantly beading heavily on his forehead. He looked desperately at Richard, then back to me. She uses the same router at the corporate office. The device must have just remembered the handshake protocol. The office doesn't have a master suite smart dimmer. Mark, I interrupted coldly, my voice slicing through his pathetic, panicked excuse like a straight razor. I didn't wait for him to formulate another lie. I didn't look at Jessica, whose face had contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. I simply reached forward, tapped the screen of his phone to wake it up, opened the Apple Home widget, and aggressively pressed my finger down on the crescent moon icon labeled midnight mode. The execution was absolutely flawless. The edge of the cliff crumbled entirely. Instantly, the heavy crystal chandelier hanging above the dining table violently dimmed down to a dark, romantic 10% output, casting the entire executive board in deep, sultry shadows. In the corner of the dining room, the massive gas fireplace ignited with a sudden, loud whoosh, sending dancing orange flames illuminating the horrified faces of the guests, and echoing through the sprawling, silent halls of the massive estate. The heavy mahogany front door made a massive, deafening, metallic thud as the smart bolt automatically engaged, locking us all inside. The house had seamlessly, automatically reacted to Mark's coming home sequence, executing a highly specific, intimate bedroom automation right in front of the CEO and the entire executive board. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. It was so agonizingly quiet you could clearly hear the ice cubes melting and shifting in the crystal water carafes. Richard slowly lowered his fork to his plate. He didn't look angry, he looked disgusted. He looked back and forth between Mark, who was literally hyperventilating in his tailored tuxedo, and Jessica, who was staring down at her own lap, her hands trembling violently, the illusion of her impenetrable fortress completely utterly annihilated. The CEO realized in real time that the highly contested VP of sales promotion wasn't based on quarterly KPIs, enterprise strategy, or market expansion. It was based entirely on who was triggering the midnight automation in the boss's bedroom. I didn't wait for the fallout to settle. The technical execution was complete. The vulnerability had been exposed and the system was completely corrupted. I calmly stood up from my chair. The scrape of the wooden legs against the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I smoothed down the front of my silk dress, picked up my clutch, and looked directly down the table at Jessica. The password might be 32 characters long, I whispered, holding her panicked, terrified gaze until she physically had to look away. But your security is clearly breached. You should really check your local administrator logs. I turned my absolute zero gaze down to Mark, who was shaking so hard his water glass was vibrating on the table. Don't bother coming home, I said, my voice completely devoid of pity. Your biometric access to the apartment lock has already been remotely revoked. And unlike this house, I've actually updated the encryption keys. My lawyer will email your new corporate email address on Monday, assuming Richard lets you keep it. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dim, firelit dining room, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. I manually unlatched the heavy deadbolt on the front door, stepping out into the freezing, torrential rain. I pulled out my own phone, which I had secretly charged on the kitchen island for exactly 5 minutes while digging through his device, and calmly called an Uber Black. I stood under the grand portico, breathing in the cold, wet night air, feeling the massive, crushing weight of a 10-year lie lifting off my chest, replaced by the sharp, terrifying thrill of total liberation. I left Mark sitting in the dark, surrounded by the smoking wreckage of his marriage, his reputation, and his entire professional career, forced to explain to the CEO of his company exactly why his personal cell phone phone was the absolute master key to the boss's bedroom. As the sleek black SUV pulled up the gravel driveway to take me back to my son and my uncompromised life, I looked back at the sprawling, fortified glass mansion glowing faintly in the rain, and I had to genuinely ask myself the question, am I the monster here for weaponizing her own smart home against them, or did they get exactly the catastrophic digital execution they deserved?
If you have made it this far and want to see more videos like this, then kindly subscribe and turn on notifications so you may never miss another story like this.